The prairie wind still carries his voice sometimes, when the grass bends low and the sky turns that particular shade of copper before sunset. A color that reminds me of the coffee he used to drink from his favorite tin cup each morning before dawn. I was 13 when Papa vanished into those endless waves of tall grass, following a cattle trail that stretched beyond the horizon like a promise that was never meant to be kept, disappearing into a landscape so vast it could swallow a man's entire existence without leaving so much as a ripple on its surface. The memory sits heavy in my chest, pressed down by 8 years of wandering, 8 years of watching Mama's eyes search every rider that appeared on our homestead's edge, her hand shading her face against the glare as she strained to make out features that might belong to the man who'd promised to return before the first frost painted the windows silver. That morning started like any other autumn day in 1874, with frost painting the windows silver and the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen stove, mingling with the wood smoke from the fireplace and the lingering scent of bacon grease from breakfast. Papa stood at the kitchen table, studying his worn leather map with calloused fingers that had built our cabin log by log, board by board, fingers that knew every knot in the wood and every nail driven into the frame that sheltered us from the prairie's indifferent fury. The lamplight caught the gold band on his left hand, the simple wedding ring that Mama had saved 3 months' egg money to buy him before they crossed the Missouri together, back when they were young and foolish enough to believe that love could conquer the loneliness of the frontier. The cattle needed moving to winter pasture, a journey that should have taken him 4 days across the rolling grassland to the Henderson place, following routes marked by generations of buffalo and later by the wheels of wagon trains that had carved their own temporary scars across the endless grass. Papa knew that route like he knew the lines in his own palm, had traveled it every autumn since we'd staked our claim and built our lives on land that demanded constant vigilance and unending labor. But the prairie holds secrets in its vastness, swallows sound and direction until a man can lose himself in the very landscape he thought he mastered, where familiar landmarks can disappear behind shifting weather and rolling terrain that looks identical from every angle. I remember the weight of his hand on my shoulder as he prepared to leave, the rough warmth of his palm through my woolen shirt, a touch that conveyed both affection and the unspoken understanding that I was growing into responsibilities that would soon be mine alone. His eyes held that distant look they got when he studied the horizon, as if he could see something the rest of us couldn't, perhaps sensing the danger that waited somewhere beyond the grassland's deceptive tranquility. The morning air tasted of coming winter, sharp and clean, with the scent of dying grass and distant wood smoke from neighboring homesteads scattered across the prairie like islands of human effort in an ocean of indifference. When he rode out that morning, his horse's hooves drummed a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth, a sound that seemed to echo the beating of my own heart as I watched him disappear into the distance. The sound faded gradually, swallowed by the immensity of the prairie, until all that remained was the whisper of wind through the grass and the hollow ache that comes when someone you love disappears into the distance, leaving behind only the promise of return and the growing certainty that promises, no matter how sincere, are fragile things that can be broken by forces beyond human control. I watched from the porch until he became a speck, then nothing at all, and even then I continued watching, as if my vigil might somehow anchor him to the world and ensure his safe return. The first day passed without worry, marked by the usual rhythms of homestead life and the comfortable assumption that Papa was methodical, careful, the kind of man who counted every head of cattle twice before moving them and who understood the prairie's moods well enough to avoid its more dangerous tempers. The second day brought restlessness, with Mama standing at the window more often, her hands working nervous patterns in her apron while she performed the daily tasks that kept our household functioning, her attention divided between present duties and absent worries. By the third day, the silence stretched like a taut rope ready to snap, and even the cattle seemed to sense something wrong, lowing restlessly in their pens and refusing to settle into their normal routines. When a week passed without word, neighbors began riding out in groups, their voices calling Papa's name across the empty grassland until the sound became a ritual repeated daily, a desperate attempt to impose human presence on a landscape that seemed to absorb their efforts without acknowledgement. The search parties returned with nothing but dust on their boots and defeat in their shoulders, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces grim with the growing realization that the prairie had claimed another soul, as it had claimed so many others who dared to cross its deceptive emptiness. Each evening brought fresh theories about what might have happened, but theories offered no comfort when measured against the vast emptiness where Papa should have been. Mama never spoke of giving up hope, but I watched it drain from her face, like color bleeding from fabric left too long in the sun, a gradual transformation that left her features sharper and her eyes more distant. She kept his coffee cup on the table for months, set his place at every meal as if he might walk through the door at any moment, whistling the tune he always whistled when he was pleased with the day's work. The winter was long and brutal, made longer by the empty chair at our table and the way conversations died when they reached the topics Papa would have addressed with his quiet wisdom and steady presence. As seasons turned to years, the sharp edge of grief wore smooth, settling into something I carried in my bones like an old injury that aches before storms, a permanent alteration in the way I moved through the world. Life continued its relentless forward motion, but always with that hollow space where Papa should have been. His absence felt as keenly as his presence had once been. Perhaps more so because absence, unlike presence, could never be taken for granted or forgotten in the press of daily concerns. The questions never stopped coming, whispered in the dark hours before dawn when sleep wouldn't come, and the prairie wind rattled the windows like something trying to get in, carrying messages in a language we could never quite understand. I learned to read the prairie's moods, to understand its capacity for both sustenance and cruelty, the way it could nurture life with surprising gentleness one day and destroy it with indifferent violence the next. But no amount of studying the grassland could explain where Papa had gone, or what had happened to the man who knew every stream, every hidden draw, every landmark for 50 miles in any direction, who could navigate by stars and wind patterns and the subtle signs that separated one stretch of grass from another. The prairie kept its secrets, and we kept our vigil, waiting for answers that seemed as distant as the horizon itself, always retreating as we approached, always promising revelation just beyond the next ridge or the next season. The search consumed our first winter after Papa's disappearance like a fever that wouldn't break, driving men from their warm firesides into the bitter cold of prairie winter, where wind could cut through the heaviest coat, and snow could blind a man so completely that he might wander in circles until his horse collapsed from exhaustion. Every clear day brought riders to our door, men with weathered faces and patient eyes, who understood loss in the way only frontier folk can, men who had buried children and wives and brothers to disease and accident, and the simple grinding hardship of trying to carve civilization from wilderness that resisted every human effort. Old Henrik from the trading post spoke of sudden storms that could turn familiar landmarks into alien territory, weather systems that appeared without warning and transformed the prairie into a white hell where direction became meaningless and survival depended more on luck than skill. He'd seen men lose their way in whiteouts that lasted 3 days, wandering in circles until their horses collapsed from exhaustion and they themselves froze to death within miles of shelter they could never find. The prairie in winter was unforgiving, he said, capable of erasing a man's tracks within hours, leaving no trace of his passage except memories that would fade as surely as footprints in snow. Mama organized the searches with the methodical precision she brought to everything, marking each area covered on Papa's old map with careful pencil strokes that gradually created a spiderweb of explored territory radiating out from our homestead. We searched the known routes first, then expanded outward in ever-widening circles, each day's effort requiring longer rides and more time away from the essential work of keeping the homestead functioning. The men rode in lines, calling Papa's name until their voices went hoarse, scanning the grass for any sign of disturbance, any break in the natural patterns that might indicate human passage or struggle. The cattle were found scattered across 20 miles of prairie, some bearing our brand, others belonging to neighbors whose herds had mixed with ours in the confusion following Papa's disappearance, creating a puzzle of ownership that took weeks to sort out. It was as if the animals had simply been abandoned mid-journey, left to wander without guidance across grassland that offered abundant grazing but no protection from predators or weather, no sign of struggle, no blood, no indication of what had separated Papa from the cattle he'd been driving, animals that knew his voice and trusted his guidance enough to follow him across any terrain. Spring brought new hope and renewed searching as the snow melted and revealed ground that had been hidden for months, exposing debris and signs that winter had covered with its white blanket. Every bit of metal glinting in the sun sent hearts racing. Every darkened patch of earth demanded investigation. Every unusual formation in the grass became a potential clue to be examined and catalogued. But the prairie yielded nothing except the usual debris of frontier life: rusted horseshoes, broken wagon wheels, the sun-bleached bones of cattle that had died in hard winters past. Fragments of lives lived and lost that told stories we could never fully reconstruct. I learned to track that spring, following the old-timers as they read the land like a book written in hoofprints and bent grass, studying the subtle signs that marked the passage of animals and men across terrain that seemed unmarked to inexperienced eyes. They taught me to see the difference between tracks made by shod horses and those made by wild animals, to understand how weather and time could erase evidence until nothing remained but the faintest impression in the earth. Shadows of presence that spoke to those who knew how to look, but all the knowledge in the world couldn't reveal what had happened to Papa, whose tracking skills had been superior to any of the men who now searched for him. The second year brought fewer searchers, as attention turned to new tragedies and fresh disappearances, the natural cycle of frontier life where the living couldn't afford to dwell overlong on the missing, lest they failed to protect themselves against the dangers that claimed new victims each season. The prairie demanded constant vigilance from those who chose to live within its embrace, and the community's resources, both human and material, had to be directed toward current threats rather than past mysteries. Mama and I continued our own searches, riding out whenever weather permitted, following hunches and half-remembered stories told around winter fires by men who claimed to have seen things they couldn't explain. We found remnants of other lives lost to the grassland. A child's wooden doll, weathered smooth by wind and rain, but still recognizable as something once cherished. A woman's hair comb embedded in a creek bank, its metal teeth bent, but its decorative pattern still visible. The metal fittings from a wagon harness wrapped around a cottonwood tree like some strange offering to the prairie gods. Each discovery raised questions that could never be answered, adding to the growing catalogue of the land's secrets, evidence of human passage that had ended in mystery and loss, stories that would never be told because their protagonists had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. The isolation began to wear on Mama in ways that showed in the set of her shoulders and the hollow spaces beneath her eyes, physical manifestations of the emotional burden she carried day after day without relief or resolution. She aged a decade in those 2 years, her hair going grey at the temples, her hands developing a tremor that came and went like weather, a visible reminder of the stress that gnawed at her even when she tried to maintain her usual composure. But she never spoke of leaving, never suggested we abandon the homestead Papa had carved from the wilderness, as if departing would constitute a betrayal of his memory and an admission that he was truly gone. As the third year dawned, I realized that searching had become less about finding Papa and more about refusing to let him go. A ritual that kept him alive in our daily lives, even as evidence of his fate remained maddeningly elusive. The ritual of riding out, of calling his name across the empty grassland, had become a way of maintaining connection with the man who had shaped our lives so profoundly that his absence felt like a physical wound that refused to heal. The prairie might have claimed his body, but we wouldn't let it claim his memory, not without a fight that would last as long as we drew breath, not without exhausting every possibility and exploring every theory, no matter how unlikely or desperate it might seem to others, who watched our efforts with sympathetic understanding and quiet skepticism. The rhythm of life on the homestead shifted like a wheel, settling into new ruts after Papa's disappearance, creating patterns that accommodated his absence while preserving the essential functions that kept us alive and our property secure against the constant threats of weather, predators, and the simple entropy that reclaimed abandoned structures with ruthless efficiency. Tasks that had been his alone now fell to me. A boy learning manhood through necessity rather than guidance, my hands growing calloused, gripping tools that still held the shape of his fingers, working wood that bore the marks of his craftsmanship like signatures of a skill I was struggling to acquire through trial and error. Mama threw herself into the garden with fierce determination, as if coaxing life from the stubborn prairie soil could somehow balance the life that had been taken from us. Her efforts producing vegetables in quantities that far exceeded our needs, but provided her with measurable evidence that she could still nurture and sustain living things. Her hands stayed busy from dawn to dusk, canning vegetables, mending clothes, maintaining the 100 small necessities that kept our homestead functioning, each task performed with an intensity that suggested she was afraid to let her mind remain idle long enough to contemplate the full magnitude of our loss. The neighbors continued their kindness in the way frontier people do, never speaking directly of charity, but always finding reasons to stop by with extra supplies or offers of help with the heavier work. Their presence filling some of the silence, but also emphasizing Papa's absence by the very fact that his role in conversations and decisions had to be filled by others. Their visits brought news from the wider community and reminders that life continued beyond our grief, that births and deaths and the ordinary business of survival proceeded according to schedules that had nothing to do with our personal tragedy. I took over the livestock duties, learning through trial and error what Papa had made look effortless, discovering that cattle were not simply animals to be herded, but individuals with personalities and preferences that had to be understood and respected if they were to be managed successfully. The cattle seemed to sense my inexperience, testing boundaries they'd never dared cross when he was alive, pushing against fences and wandering farther from water than they'd ever attempted under his watchful eye. But gradually, through patience and stubborn determination, I earned their respect, learning to speak to them in the calm, authoritative voice Papa had used, a tone that conveyed confidence even when I felt anything but certain of my abilities. Mama began teaching school in the nearest settlement that autumn, riding the 6 miles to town 3 days a week on Papa's old mare, a routine that provided structure to her weeks and income that supplemented what we could earn from the homestead's production. The children's voices and the routine of lessons provided her with something beyond the endless searching and waiting that had defined our existence since his disappearance, giving her purpose that extended beyond our personal tragedy and connected her to the community's future in ways that gradually began to heal the isolation that grief had created. She came home each evening with stories of her students, tiny windows into lives that continued despite the shadows that had settled over our own existence. tales of children's accomplishments and concerns that reminded us that the world contained joy and hope and possibility even in the midst of loss. The routine of preparing lessons and evaluating students' progress gave her something to think about besides Papa's fate, though I often caught her staring out the schoolhouse window toward the prairie, as if hoping to see a familiar figure riding toward town with explanations for his long absence. Winter evenings found us huddled around the stove, Mama reading aloud from books Papa had ordered from back east, his voice somehow present in the stories she chose and the way she inflected certain passages that had been his favorites. The lamplight created a circle of warmth against the prairie darkness, but beyond that circle lay the vast emptiness where Papa had vanished. A presence felt more keenly in its absence than it had ever been when filled, an emptiness that seemed to press against our windows like something alive and hungry for the warmth we maintained against its cold indifference. I learned to sleep through the wind that rattled our windows and moaned through the eaves like something alive and hungry. The prairie's voice speaking in languages we could never understand but always felt in our bones. But some nights, when the sound rose to a particular pitch, I imagined I could hear Papa's voice calling from somewhere in that darkness, urgent with some message I could never quite understand, words that seemed important but remained just beyond the range of comprehension. Those were the nights I lay awake until dawn, listening to the prairie's restless voice and wondering if the dead could speak to the living through wind and distance and the accumulated weight of love that survives the body's destruction. The homestead itself began to show signs of Papa's absence in small but noticeable ways that accumulated like dust, each minor failure adding to the growing evidence that his knowledge and skills had been more essential to our survival than we'd fully understood while he was alive. The barn door that he'd always planned to rehang properly developed a more pronounced sag, requiring constant adjustment to keep it closed against wind that seemed determined to force its way into every structure we tried to maintain. The fence line near the creek needed repair where cattle had pushed through weak spots. Papa would have noticed and fixed immediately, his eye for such details having prevented many small problems from becoming larger disasters. By the end of that third year, we had learned to carry his absence like a stone in our pockets, always present but no longer sharp enough to cut, a weight that had become part of the way we moved through the world. The acute grief had settled into something more bearable, a permanent alteration in the landscape of our lives that changed how we saw everything else, without necessarily destroying our capacity for happiness or hope. We had become different people than we'd been when he was alive, shaped by loss into something harder and more resilient, but also somehow diminished by the enormity of what we'd lost, like a building that remains standing after losing a crucial support beam, but can never again bear the same weight it once carried with ease. Time moved differently after Papa's disappearance, measured not in seasons, but in the accumulation of small changes that marked his continued absence. A calendar written in the things that broke down without his attention, and the skills I slowly acquired through necessity and stubborn determination. My voice deepened, and my shoulders broadened as I grew into the work that had once been his, handling tools that gradually became extensions of my hands, rather than borrowed implements, learning through countless small failures and minor successes the craftsmanship that Papa had made look effortless, but which required years to master. The tools themselves seemed to remember his touch, their handles worn smooth by his hands and shaped to accommodate his particular way of holding them. And gradually I found myself adopting his movements and techniques as if the implements themselves were teaching me the methods he'd never had time to pass on directly. Each repair I completed successfully felt like a small victory over the forces that threatened to reclaim our homestead, proof that I was becoming capable of maintaining what he'd built and perhaps even expanding on his work as my skills developed. Mama's teaching expanded to include children from 3 surrounding settlements, her reputation growing as word spread of her patience and skill with students who came to school speaking different languages and carrying the particular challenges that accompanied families trying to establish themselves in territory that demanded everything they had to give. She rode longer distances now, sometimes staying overnight in town when weather made the journey home treacherous, her absence from the homestead requiring me to take on responsibilities that had previously been shared between us. The mare that had once carried Papa to his fate now carried Mama to her purpose, as if the animal understood its role in keeping our family connected to the larger world, and took seriously the responsibility of delivering its rider safely across distances that could be dangerous for a woman traveling alone. The horse's steady temperament and reliable sense of direction made it possible for Mama to accept teaching positions that other women might have found too risky, her income gradually becoming essential to our household's financial stability. The 4th anniversary of Papa's disappearance passed without ceremony, marked only by the extra silence at our dinner table and the way Mama's eyes lingered on the empty chair where he'd once sat. His presence felt more keenly on that particular day than during the ordinary business of daily life. We no longer spoke of finding him, but neither did we speak of accepting his death, his existence suspended in a liminal space between presence and absence, neither fully gone nor entirely there, his influence continuing to shape our decisions and our understanding of what constituted proper behavior and sound judgment. I learned to read the prairie's moods as Papa had, understanding the subtle signs that warned of approaching storms or the presence of wolves near the cattle, knowledge that came slowly and sometimes at the cost of mistakes that taught harsh lessons about the consequences of misreading the land's signals. The grassland revealed its secrets reluctantly, demanding years of patient observation before yielding its wisdom. But gradually I developed the instincts that allowed me to anticipate weather changes and locate strayed animals and recognize the signs that indicated human presence in territory that appeared empty to inexperienced eyes. But for all my growing knowledge, the prairie never offered the slightest hint of what had become of the man who had taught me to read its signs, as if his disappearance existed outside the natural order that governed everything else in our experience. Other mysteries resolved themselves over time. Cattle that vanished in spring storms were found months later in distant valleys. Travelers who failed to arrive on schedule eventually appeared with stories of detours and delays. Even graves that were lost in winter revealed themselves when snow melted and landmarks became visible again. But Papa remained absent in a way that seemed to violate the basic principles that governed how things disappeared and were found again. Neighbors began to speak of Papa in past tense, their conversations carefully avoiding any reference to him coming home, their sympathy gradually shifting from hope to acceptance in ways that felt like small betrayals, even though I understood the practical necessity of moving forward with life. New families arrived in the territory, people who had never known him, and gradually his name faded from daily discourse, except in our household, where his memory remained vivid and his influence continued to guide our decisions about everything from crop rotation to the proper way to handle difficult horses. Only Mama and I continued to keep his memory alive in the small rituals of daily life, setting his place at table, saving his favorite newspaper clippings, maintaining his tools in perfect working order as if he might return at any moment and expect to find everything exactly as he'd left it. These practices probably seemed strange to visitors who didn't understand the comfort they provided, the way they allowed us to maintain connection with Papa even as the world around us moved forward without him. The homestead prospered despite Papa's absence, or perhaps because of the fierce determination his loss had sparked in both Mama and me, our success becoming a kind of memorial to his memory and proof that his efforts to establish our family in the territory had not been wasted. Our garden produced abundantly, the cattle multiplied, and slowly we began to accumulate the modest wealth that marked successful homesteaders. our prosperity measured not just in money, but in the satisfaction of work done well and obstacles overcome through persistence and careful planning. But prosperity felt hollow without Papa there to share in our achievements, each success shadowed by awareness that the man who had made it possible would never see the fruits of his labor or know that his family had survived and even thrived despite the tragedy that had taken him from us. We celebrated our accomplishments quietly, acknowledging them more as duties fulfilled than as victories won, carrying success with the same dignified restraint that had characterized Papa's approach to both triumph and setback. The man appeared on our horizon like a heat mirage given substance, riding a horse that had clearly traveled long distances across hard country, its coat dulled by dust and its gait showing the careful economy of movement that marked animals accustomed to covering great distances on limited forage. His clothes bore the dust of many trails, fabric worn soft by wind and weather, and his face carried the weathered look of someone who had spent years reading the sky for signs of weather and trouble, eyes that held the particular alertness of men who lived by their ability to judge character and circumstance quickly and accurately. When he asked permission to water his horse at our creek, Mama invited him to stay for supper, as was the custom in country where hospitality could mean the difference between life and death for travelers caught between settlements when weather turned dangerous or supplies ran low. The invitation was extended automatically, part of the unwritten code that governed frontier life. But I noticed the way Mama studied his face as he approached the house, as if searching for some sign of recognition or threat. Her instincts sharpened by years of living with the knowledge that danger could approach wearing any face. He gave his name as William Garrett, a man who bought and sold cattle across 3 territories, following herds and markets with the patience of someone who understood that profit came to those willing to wait for the right opportunity and travel whatever distances were necessary to connect buyers with sellers. His conversation revealed familiarity with places we'd never seen and people we'd never met, the wide-ranging knowledge of someone whose business required understanding of economic conditions and political developments across vast areas where communication was slow and information was valuable currency. His eyes held the restless quality common to men who lived their lives in the saddle, always looking toward the next destination, the next possibility hidden beyond the horizon, men for whom home was less a place than a temporary camp between journeys. But there was something else in his expression, a gravity that suggested his current journey involved more than routine business, as if he carried news or information that weighed on him in ways that ordinary commercial transactions never did. Over dinner, he spoke of the changes sweeping across the prairie as railroads pushed westward and settlements grew into towns, transforming territory that had remained unchanged for generations into something entirely different within the span of a few years. He'd seen homesteads abandoned as quickly as they'd been claimed, families defeated by drought or debt, or simply the grinding isolation that wore down even the strongest spirits. Their dreams of prosperity crushed by realities that no amount of determination could overcome. But he'd also seen fortunes made by those clever enough to adapt to changing circumstances, men who understood that opportunity often disguised itself as crisis for those bold enough to recognize it. Mama mentioned Papa's disappearance almost casually, testing the stranger's reaction to see if the story might spark some recognition or memory, her voice carefully neutral as she related facts that had long since been worn smooth by repetition. Garrett's expression grew thoughtful, and he admitted that he'd heard similar tales throughout his travels. Men who'd vanished from well-known trails without explanation, disappearances that followed patterns too consistent to be entirely coincidental. The prairie, he said, had a way of claiming those who underestimated its capacity for sudden violence, but it also attracted men whose business thrived in territory where law enforcement was spotty and questions were rarely asked. He spoke of a particular stretch of grassland, 2 days' ride northeast of our homestead, an area avoided by most travelers due to its reputation for swallowing men without trace. Territory that appeared no different from surrounding prairie, but which had acquired a sinister reputation among those who made their living moving cattle and goods across the frontier. Local tribes had stories about that region, tales of warriors who'd ridden into the tall grass and never emerged, accounts that might have been dismissed as superstition if similar stories hadn't begun accumulating among white settlers who had no contact with tribal legends. White settlers had added their own tales to the growing legend. Stories of entire wagon trains found abandoned with no sign of struggle or disturbance, as if their occupants had simply chosen to walk away from everything they owned and disappear into the grassland's immensity. Traders spoke of meeting men in that area who seemed nervous and evasive, unwilling to discuss their business or explain their presence in territory that offered little in the way of legitimate opportunities for commerce or settlement. The conversation turned to other topics as the evening progressed, but I noticed the way Garrett's eyes kept returning to Mama's face, as if he were memorizing her features or perhaps comparing them to some half-remembered image. His attention focused in ways that seemed to go beyond ordinary politeness. When he finally retired to the barn for the night, I caught him studying the photograph of Papa that hung above our mantelpiece, his expression unreadable in the lamplight, his silence suggesting he was wrestling with some internal decision about what he should or shouldn't reveal. Morning brought a change in the stranger's demeanor, a restlessness that suggested he was eager to continue his journey, but also reluctant to leave without accomplishing some purpose that had brought him to our door. But before he left, he pulled a small leather pouch from his saddlebags and presented it to Mama with a gravity that seemed out of proportion to the gesture, his movements careful and deliberate, as if the pouch contained something far more valuable than its modest appearance suggested. Inside, nestled against soft doeskin that had been carefully arranged to prevent damage, lay a simple gold wedding ring that caught the morning sunlight like a fragment of captured fire, its surface worn smooth by years of wear, but still bearing the faint inscription that Mama had paid extra to have engraved inside the band. The silence that followed his revelation stretched like a held breath, filled with the weight of 8 years' worth of questions suddenly demanding answers, the small circle of gold representing both an ending and a beginning, proof that Papa's story had continued beyond the point where our knowledge ended. 3 weeks after William Garrett's visit, Mama and I began preparing for a journey that would take us farther from our homestead than either of us had traveled since arriving in the territory, packing supplies for an expedition that represented both our last hope of finding answers and our final attempt to lay Papa's memory to rest. The neighbors thought we were chasing ghosts, pursuing answers that had been buried too long under prairie grass and accumulated years. But the wedding ring's discovery had rekindled something in both of us, a flame we'd thought extinguished by time and disappointment, but which now burned with renewed intensity. The preparation required careful planning, as we would be traveling through territory where supplies were scarce and help might be days away if trouble developed. Our survival dependent on the provisions we carried and our ability to navigate using maps that might or might not reflect current conditions on the ground. We arranged for the Henderson boy to watch our cattle and tend the essential chores, leaving detailed instructions for every aspect of homestead management and hoping that our absence wouldn't extend beyond the 3 weeks we'd planned for the journey. Mama insisted on bringing Papa's photograph wrapped carefully in oilcloth to protect it from weather and handling, as if his image might somehow assist in our search for answers or provide comfort during the difficult days ahead. The morning we departed, our homestead looked smaller than I remembered, dwarfed by the immensity of the task ahead and the vast distances we would have to cross to reach the trading post where Papa's ring had been discovered. Our familiar surroundings suddenly seeming fragile and temporary against the backdrop of the endless prairie. The first days took us through familiar country, past homesteads where we stopped to water our horses and share news with neighbors who wished us well despite their skepticism about our mission. Their kindness tempered by concern for our safety and doubts about the wisdom of pursuing leads that might prove to be false trails leading nowhere. But gradually, the landscape changed, becoming wilder and less settled as we moved north toward country that existed more in rumor than reliable knowledge. Territory that appeared on maps as blank spaces marked only with warnings about uncertain conditions and limited information. The grass grew taller as we traveled, reaching heights that could conceal a mounted rider and creating a sense of enclosure that made navigation difficult and progress hard to judge. Our world reduced to the narrow corridors between walls of vegetation that rustled with every breath of wind. The sky seemed larger somehow, stretched thin over distances that defied comprehension, its immensity pressing down on us like a weight that threatened to crush our determination and send us fleeing back to the familiar comforts of home and routine. We followed game trails when the main routes petered out, trusting our horses' instincts to find water and safe passage through terrain that showed little evidence of human presence. Our progress measured not in miles, but in the gradual accumulation of small victories over obstacles that would have turned back less determined travelers. Mama proved to be a more capable traveler than I'd expected, her years of riding to town having prepared her for long hours in the saddle and the discomforts of sleeping under stars. Her resilience, a reminder that frontier life had shaped her into someone far stronger than her quiet demeanor might suggest. The nights were the hardest part of the journey, when the prairie's vastness pressed in around our small camp and every sound carried the potential for threat. Wolves howling in the distance and cattle lowing somewhere in the darkness beyond the reach of our firelight. We took turns standing watch, not because we expected specific danger, but because the openness left us feeling exposed and vulnerable in ways that made sleep difficult without the security of knowing someone was alert to potential problems. The trading post, when we finally reached it, looked like something assembled from the dreams of desperate men and the reality of harsh economics. A collection of weathered buildings clustered around a muddy main street that served as the center of commerce for territory stretching hundreds of miles in every direction. It was the kind of place where questions weren't asked and explanations weren't expected, where men came to conduct business that couldn't be conducted in more civilized settings, and where survival depended on understanding the unwritten rules that governed relationships between people who lived outside the reach of conventional law. The proprietor, a man named Macready, remembered Garrett's visit and the saddle that had yielded Papa's ring. His recollection aided by the fact that unusual items often stayed in his inventory for years before finding buyers, the remote location of his establishment, meaning that customers were few and transactions were memorable. He led us through storage areas filled with the accumulated possessions of men who'd failed to return for their belongings, each item representing a story that would never be told and questions that would never be answered. The saddle that had contained Papa's ring sat among dozens of others, its leather darkened by age and weather but still recognizable as quality workmanship. The silver conchos tarnished but still bearing the distinctive pattern that marked it as coming from a particular saddle maker in Kansas whose work was prized by men who could afford the best equipment. Seeing it there, abandoned among the forgotten possessions of other lost souls, brought Papa's fate into sharp focus in ways that 8 years of wandering and searching had never quite accomplished. The camp beside the stream spoke in whispers of a story that would never be fully told, its secrets scattered by wind and rain until only fragments remained, each piece requiring careful interpretation and patient reconstruction to yield even a portion of the truth we'd traveled so far to discover. We found horse bones near a fallen log, the skeleton picked clean by scavengers, but still articulated enough to suggest the animal had died where it lay, rather than being dragged to that spot by predators. the arrangement of bones speaking to a natural death rather than violence. Papa's horse had been a sturdy bay mare with distinctive white markings, and though the bones could have belonged to any horse, they were the right size and age, their position suggesting an animal that had simply laid down and never risen again. The trading post records, such as they were, showed that the saddle had been brought in by a group of hunters who'd found it alongside this very stream 20 miles east of the settlement. Men who made their living tracking game through territory that most people avoided, due to its isolation and the persistent rumors about travelers who'd vanished without explanation. They'd also discovered the remains of a campsite, though weather and scavengers had eliminated most traces of whoever had made camp there, leaving only the most durable evidence of human presence. The hunters had kept the gear, hoping to sell it, but the remote location of the trading post meant that customers were few and sales infrequent, equipment often sitting for years before finding buyers. McCready provided rough directions to the area where the hunters had made their discovery, warning us that the terrain was difficult and that late summer storms could make travel dangerous, flash floods turning peaceful streams into torrents that could sweep away anything in their path. But he also admitted a grudging respect for our determination, recognizing something familiar in the way grief could drive people to attempt impossible journeys in search of closure. Having seen other families arrive at his establishment seeking traces of loved ones who disappeared into the prairie's indifferent embrace. The stream where Papa's saddle had been found lay in a valley between two ridges, a place where water ran clear over smooth stones and cottonwoods provided shade from the prairie sun, their leaves rustling with a sound like whispered conversations. It was beautiful country, the kind of place that might tempt a weary traveler to rest longer than planned, but it was also isolated, cut off from main trails and the safety that came with regular human traffic. The valley felt peaceful during the day, but as evening approached and shadows lengthened across the water, it took on a more ominous quality, as if the peaceful appearance masked darker possibilities. We spent 2 days searching the area, looking for any sign that might explain how Papa's gear had come to rest beside that distant stream. Our investigation hampered by the years that had passed and the way weather erased evidence with ruthless efficiency. The remains of an old campsite were still visible if you knew what to look for. A circle of stones that had once contained fire, blackened earth that spoke of multiple uses over time, a depression in the ground where someone had arranged bedding. But 8 years of weather had erased most traces, leaving only questions that seemed to multiply with each discovery. Mama searched the area with methodical precision, sifting through years of accumulated debris with hands that had grown steady with purpose, her movements careful and deliberate as she examined every stone and stick that might once have been touched by human hands. She found buttons that might have come from Papa's coat, though time and weather had stripped away any distinctive markings that might have confirmed their origin. A piece of metal that could have been part of a bridle bit gleamed among the stones of the old fire pit, corroded but recognizable to someone familiar with horse gear, its presence suggesting that whoever had camped here had been traveling with animals. The stream itself provided the most compelling evidence, revealing objects that the current had wedged among the rocks during high water seasons, items that had been carried downstream from their original locations and deposited where flowing water met obstacles. Mama discovered a knife handle made from polished antler, its blade long since rusted away, but its grip carved with initials that might have been Papa's if viewed from the right angle in the right light, the letters worn smooth by handling but still faintly visible to someone who knew what to look for. I found fragments of a leather journal, the pages dissolved to pulp, but the binding still holding traces of what had once been words, ink stains that spoke of careful record-keeping and the habits of a man who documented his thoughts and observations. The leather bore the distinctive tooling that marked it as Papa's work, patterns he'd learned from his father and passed on through his own careful craftsmanship, evidence that seemed to confirm our worst fears about his fate, while simultaneously raising new questions about what had brought him to this remote valley. On our final day at the camp, I discovered something that changed my understanding of everything we'd found, evidence that transformed our reconstruction of Papa's final journey from tragedy into something far more complex and disturbing. Hidden beneath a ledge of rock that formed a natural shelter, wrapped in canvas that had somehow survived 8 years of weather through the protection of its concealed location, lay Papa's journal and a packet of letters tied with faded ribbon, documents that had waited all these years for someone to find them and read the story they contained. The pages were stained and brittle, requiring careful handling to avoid further damage, but still readable enough to reveal Papa's thoughts and plans during his final weeks, words written in his familiar hand that brought his voice back to life with startling immediacy. The letters bore postmarks from distant towns and signatures of men whose names meant nothing to us. Correspondence that spoke of business opportunities and confidential arrangements, deals that had to be concluded without public knowledge or family consultation until everything was finalized and success assured. Papa had been carrying on correspondence with a land speculator in the North Country for months before his disappearance, discussing the possibility of selling our homestead and relocating to territory that promised greater opportunities for those willing to take calculated risks. The letters spoke of secret meetings and confidential negotiations, deals that had to be kept quiet to prevent competitors from interfering or prices from being driven up by premature publicity, arrangements that required trust between men who knew each other only through reputation and mutual acquaintances. We returned home carrying Papa's journal and wedding ring, but also bearing the heavier burden of understanding what had really happened in that distant valley, knowledge that answered our questions while creating new wounds that might never heal completely. The truth was both more and less than we'd imagined, explaining his disappearance while raising troubling questions about the choices he'd made in his final months, decisions that had been driven by love, but which had led to consequences that would haunt our family for generations. Mama read and reread his journal entries, searching for clues we might have missed, reasons that might justify the secrets he'd kept from us, explanations that might transform his betrayal of our trust into something more forgivable. The homestead looked different when we returned, smaller somehow, as if our expanded understanding of Papa's final days had altered the scale of everything familiar, reducing the significance of improvements he'd made and accomplishments he'd achieved by revealing them as preparations for a future he'd never intended us to share. The extra fencing, the expanded barn, the careful attention to details that would matter to potential buyers, all of it had been preparation for a sale he'd never lived to complete, evidence of plans that had excluded us from decisions that would have changed our lives forever. Mama struggled with feelings of betrayal that competed with grief and understanding, her emotions cycling through anger and forgiveness like weather systems crossing the prairie, each phase bringing its own particular pain and its own temporary relief. She'd loved a man who'd kept crucial secrets, who'd risked everything without consulting her, who'd died pursuing opportunities she might never have approved if she'd been given the chance to voice her concerns. But she'd also loved a man who'd been trying to provide better for his family, whose mistakes had been born from hope rather than selfishness, whose final actions had been motivated by the same love that had driven him to build our homestead and work so hard to ensure our survival. The journal entries revealed a man torn between loyalty to his family and the lure of possibilities he couldn't discuss openly, wrestling with decisions that would affect all our lives, but which he felt compelled to make alone, rather than burden us with uncertainties that might never materialize into actual opportunities. He'd discovered mineral deposits on land that could be acquired cheaply if certain arrangements were made quietly and quickly. But the venture required him to travel alone, to meet with men whose reputations couldn't bear scrutiny, to risk everything for a chance at wealth that might transform our lives or destroy them entirely. The final entries, written in a shaky hand that suggested haste or distress, spoke of betrayal and danger. Papa's careful handwriting deteriorating as fear and urgency overwhelmed his usual methodical approach to record-keeping. He'd realized too late that his partners in the scheme had plans that didn't include sharing the profits with a small-time homesteader. Their true intentions becoming clear only when he was too far from home and helped to extricate himself safely from arrangements that had seemed profitable but which had revealed themselves to be traps designed to eliminate inconvenient witnesses. Reading Papa's words in that remote valley, surrounded by the remnants of his final camp and the evidence of whatever violence had ended his life, I finally understood the weight he'd been carrying in those last weeks before his disappearance. The impossible burden of trying to secure our future while protecting us from the knowledge of the risks he was taking. His love for us had driven him to attempt something beyond his experience and judgment, leading him into territory where his prairie wisdom was useless against men who understood violence in ways that honest homesteaders never could. I found myself studying Papa's journal for clues about the men who'd killed him, wondering if they were still alive, still profiting from schemes that had cost him his life. Their names and faces burned into my memory by anger that demanded satisfaction, even though practical considerations argued against any attempt at revenge. But the names he'd mentioned were common ones, the locations vague, and 8 years had erased whatever trail might once have led to justice, time and distance combining to make vengeance impossible, even if it had been wise to attempt. The neighbors who learned about our discoveries reacted with the stoic acceptance that characterized frontier life, acknowledging that death came in many forms and that the dead deserved respect regardless of the circumstances that had claimed them. Their responses shaped by familiarity with violence and premature death. Some expressed surprise at Papa's secret dealings, but most seemed to understand the desperate optimism that drove men to take risks they couldn't afford, chasing dreams that always seemed just beyond reach in territory where legitimate opportunities were scarce and competition was fierce. Mama returned Papa's ring to its place in her jewelry box, but she never wore it again, as if the weight of its history had made it too heavy for daily use, the circle of gold bearing too many associations with secrets and lies and the violence that had ended his life. She kept his journal on the kitchen table beside her own, sometimes reading passages aloud during evening meals, as if sharing his words could somehow bridge the gap between his intentions and their consequences. His voice still present in our daily lives, even though his body lay buried somewhere in that distant valley. I married my neighbor girl the following spring, bringing her home to a homestead that had been shaped by loss but strengthened by understanding, our wedding taking place in the shadow of Papa's story, but also in the light of possibilities that his sacrifice had made visible. She listened to Papa's story without judgment, accepting him as part of our family's history rather than dwelling on the mistakes that had led to his death. Her practical nature helping her understand that good men sometimes made poor choices when driven by circumstances beyond their control. Years have passed since that journey north, and I've learned to carry Papa's story like one of his tools, something useful that serves its purpose without requiring constant attention, knowledge that shapes decisions without dominating daily thoughts. The prairie wind still brings his voice sometimes, but now I understand what he's trying to say. His words carrying lessons about the complexity of love and the difficulty of protecting family members from dangers they can't see or understand. The homestead prospers still, built on the foundation Papa laid and sustained by the knowledge that love doesn't require perfection, only the courage to keep building something worth preserving despite the mistakes and setbacks that mark every human life. And somewhere in the tall grass, in a valley beside a clear running stream, The bones of his horse marked the place where one man's dreams ended and his family's understanding began, a location that will remain sacred to our family even though we'll never visit it again, where the prairie keeps its secrets but sometimes gives back what it has taken, transformed by time and distance into something that resembles wisdom more than simple loss.
If you like this story, leave a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next stories.